Hey all, here at OS Reviews. You're watching our throwback review of the Apple iPad 3rd generation here in early 2018. In this video, we'll be briefly discussing whether this is still a worthwhile tablet to pick up if you're on a budget heading into this new year. Believe it or not, the iPad 3rd generation is nearing 6 years old. It came out in 2012. It's insane that so many years have passed by, but the design still remains quite elegant, and the specifications also aren't bad, especially as a budget device here in 2018. We're talking about a 9.7-inch Retina display. It's an IPS panel that packs a 2K resolution, which is 1248 by 1536. So it remains actually pretty sharp in terms of overall PPI, as well as the overall details that you get from watching videos and browsing the web. There's also dual cameras. There's a 5-megapixel camera on the back and also a 2-megapixel on the front for doing FaceTime and video chatting. Underneath the hood, there's also access to 1 gig of RAM, which is the same amount of RAM you'll find on the iPhone 6 and the 6 Plus. So in that comparison, it doesn't seem that bad, especially since iOS is pretty optimized to run smoothly on lower-end hardware. There's also the dual-core Apple A5X processor, which is slightly faster than the previous A5 that was found on the iPad 2. Battery capacity is 11,560 milliamp hours, giving you over a week of standby, and even today, the battery life is easily one of the best parts of the iPad and the iPad 3rd gen. It will last you for easily 3 to 4 days on a single charge, depending on your use, without any problems for web browsing and watching YouTube videos. One of the areas where the iPad 3rd gen, though, is starting to show its age is in its weight, because this was one of the last times where we saw a more traditional, bulkier form factor, and then we saw the iPad Air in 2013. So this feels a lot heavier than more modern iPads. It's not necessarily a bad thing, though, because it's still relatively slim, and the heft contributes to having something that feels slightly more premium in your hands. There's also an antenna bar on the top here for Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, GPS, as well as cellular connectivity, because this is the 4G LTE version with AT&T that I have in my hands. When it first came out, the price point was also slightly premium. Today we're used to these prices for electronics and smartphones, but this was the 16GB version that came priced at $500, and then you could add $100 for 32 gigs or 64 gigs respectively. 16 gigs here in 2018 is a little low for memory, but as long as you were careful on installing not too many programs, apps, games, and music content, then you should still be fine overall. Something I will want to point out right from the start, though, is the iPad 3rd generation, like the iPad 2, is only upgradable to iOS version 9, essentially. So it's no longer the most up-to-date version of iOS, which is 11 as we're recording this video. With that being said, most of the games and apps can still be run on the tablet. If you go to the store and you want to download an app, it will ask you, do you want to download a slightly older version? And about 99% of the time, an app can still be run on the device. So let's take a closer look at the design of the iPad 3 now. We have a smart cover attached. It's a folio keyboard that was an optional accessory, and this is one of the best parts of picking up something like an iPad versus a slightly cheaper, let's say, Android tablet for about the same price. The iPad 3rd generation can now be found on Amazon and eBay as a used device for around $100, believe it or not. So it's not too expensive. For $100, if you're talking about an Android tablet today, you'll seldom find one with as impressive as a display. It's probably going to be something like 720p, and memory configurations will probably be similar for $100. In addition, you won't find nearly as many accessories. Since the iPad was a much more popular device, you can still easily find chargers, accessories, and other design peripherals cheaply online. So that is one of the benefits. Alright, so taking a closer look, one thing that the iPad 3rd gen does not have is a biometric fingerprint scanner or Touch ID. Having a fingerprint scanner, I think, isn't a necessity on a tablet, but it is convenient. So if you want to use Apple Pay, if you want to really quickly use your fingerprint instead of typing in a password for downloading apps, that's not something that you'll find on this particular iPad. But otherwise, the design in terms of the bezels and the overall form factor, aspect ratio of the screen, still looks fairly attractive. So again, this part attaches magnetically onto the side of the iPad. It's the smart folio cover, and on this version we have the SIM card tray. On the side here there's also access to a power key, a volume rocker, and also a mute switch for the speakers. Speaking of, the speakers are located at the very bottom of the unit. However, its tapered design means you can still lie it flat on a surface and sound will still come out without too many issues. On the very top of the iPad, there's also access to a traditional 3.5mm headphone jack, which again is one of the better features of a slightly older device. You can plug in your own headphones without any problems. There's the Apple logo, and down below here, it's the 30-pin docked connector. So this is the last iPad, one of the last Apple mobile devices, period, that came with the older charging adapter. You can still, again, find lots of accessories for it, but a Lightning port is both faster as well as reversible, so you won't find that more modern port on this particular iPad, unfortunately. Alright, so going into the main screen here, we have a beautiful 9.7-inch display. You're immediately greeted to the display with this dynamic, slightly moving wallpaper. The screen remains as vivid and sharp as always, and it's an area where the resolution and PPI hasn't really changed here in 2018 for newer Apple iPads, so you still get a very impressive multimedia and content consumption experience. We have access to a drag-down notification shade that will tell us our notifications split into multiple panels, and I can swipe up again to have access to quick shortcuts for my volume, wireless options, launching into the camera, changing the screen brightness, and playing back music. I can also double tap to have access to my multitasking drawer and launching back and forth between different apps, as well as closing them if I don't want to use an individual app. And that all still works just fine. You can see that for general navigation between different pages, it still remains quite smooth and responsive without any real problems. I can also long hold to access Siri, which still works quite well as a voice recognition AI assistant, just like on more modern phones today. Previously, I talked about how the iPad 3 is not capable of running the latest iOS software, but that actually might be a good thing considering the slightly older hardware and limited RAM as well as a processor. Running on a slightly older version will mean the performance will also probably be a little bit faster. So if you can, I would recommend keeping this on something like iOS version 8, for instance, for the fastest experience. What that means, though, is that there isn't a page to the left of the main screen that gives you access to news, RSS feeds, commonly used apps, so there isn't that additional panel, but you just have a very traditional view of all your apps, and you can still pull down here, though, to search up commonly used apps or search the web for something really quickly. The keyboard here remains easy to use just because, again, the display is sharp, supports multi-touch, and it's responsive as always to use. Taking a look at the camera performance first, although it's passable for emergency situations, it really isn't an excellent camera, and it's never been for Apple iPads historically, even modern ones. Your iPhone will get you much better shots because Apple puts more design and thought into their lenses on their phones. In general, I think taking images with a tablet, period, is a bit of a taboo because it's large, it's a little awkward, and it's probably not quite as convenient since you're not going to be carrying this around everywhere with you, most likely. But you do have a camera here. You can see that the field of view is definitely a little bit more limited than on a phone, but at least it's relatively quick to focus, and we have a very clean user interface as expected from Apple. There's HDR mode. You can tap to focus, adjusting the brightness as well. I can also toggle between square, photo, or taking video, and video can be captured in 720p HD resolution. The front-facing camera is actually a little bit worse, but it still captures a good amount of light, so even when there's not too much light in the room, your face is still illuminated pretty well for FaceTime, even though it's not the most detailed shot. What you can tell is that colors are also pretty accurate, but if you zoom all the way in, of course, images and details start to look a little fuzzy, just because 5 megapixels, isn't really a high, resolution here in 2018. But overall, again, it works for some quick shots, and overall colors are pretty realistic. The camera, though, does not have optical image stabilization, so if you're shaking, especially in HDR mode, then your shots will turn out significantly more blurry. But as a whole, not a bad camera, especially for a tablet, even here in 2018, and paired with a very impressive display, overall it makes for, again, a pretty enjoyable view back experience if you're playing back slideshows. And taking a look at web browsing next, I'll use Safari, because it's the built-in browser, and we're loading up what looks like the full desktop version of the New York Times. It's a good benchmark because it's a complex page with many moving elements and many ads as well, which becomes a nightmare for lower-end hardware hardware typically. You can see that on here, it's definitely not as instantaneous as on the latest iPad Pro. In fact, it's struggling a little bit more for loading up some of these ads, but as long as you're patient and you're willing to wait for a few seconds longer, everything will still render, and once it does render, it remains smooth and overall pretty responsive. So again, the web browsing experience is still pretty good. Safari was one of the first WebKit-based browsers available for mobile devices, and if you don't like it, you can always download Chrome or Firefox. The sharp resolution paired with the unique 3:2 aspect ratio means that reading content is an area where the iPad really shines, and even on an older model that remains true. Newspapers feel like you're holding onto a physical form as opposed to something digital, and overall, again, text is extremely sharp, legible, and images pop. So for web browsing, it remains easy to use. I can also open up multiple tabs, open up my bookmarks, and also share this to other friends and family using social media. For streaming video, I'm going to try using YouTube next. I should point out that in performance, the tablet still remains fairly cool. It gets a little bit warmer on the edges of the unit, and the reception quality also seems to be quite good. We're connected using Wi-Fi right now, and the router is actually on a different level of the building, so it's going through quite a few different walls right now, but the connection seems to be quite stable. From here, you can see that the interface still remains fairly easy to navigate, although you'll occasionally have a few more moments of hesitation and sluggishness compared to the latest iPad, but overall, everything is still usable. When you're switching orientations between, let's say, full screen versus portrait mode, that's where you'll notice definitely some hesitation, and that's where the slower processor becomes more evident. But the interesting thing is once you are actually playing the video, either in full 1080p or even in 2K, everything remains really smooth. The sound quality is great. You can also scrub between parts of the video, and there's almost no delay as well. So performance of video playback is still quite good for media consumption. Takeaway from that audio sample is that the quality is actually pretty good. The speaker on the iPad has a larger driver and more space than on a phone, so it packs more volume. We're only about 30% there, and it still filled up the small room without any problems. For mids and highs, it does a great job. It sounds quite natural, in fact, despite the fact that it's only a mono speaker and not stereo. However, bass is definitely lacking. If you want to hear lower frequencies, bass drops, and EDM music, then it doesn't come across quite as prominently. However, Bluetooth as well as the headphone port works really well if you want to connect it to something larger for a more enjoyable experience when sharing your music with friends and family. But for movies and quick clips, the built-in speaker works good enough. Other utility tools on the iPad 3 are fairly expected. There's access to aforementioned FaceTime, which enables you to communicate still very well with other friends and family, regardless of what version of the iPhone or iPad they currently own. There's Calendar, which syncs your notifications to the cloud through iTunes, and there's also Apple Maps built in for navigation. Not quite as good as Google Maps, but it works. For gaming, as long as you're playing back average and not too demanding GPU games like Asphalt 8, everything still runs actually pretty well. So here's Stack. It's a pretty fun game, but again, it's not very graphically intensive, but you can see that there are no real missed or dropped frames. Everything remains pretty smooth in terms of the animations. Touchscreen is responsive, and I have no real complaints in terms of loading times either. It remains respectable. So again, these modern titles can still be played back without any problems. You just have to wait for a little bit longer, and if you're playing back something really graphically intensive like Asphalt 8, then that becomes a bit more challenging for the processor. Still playable, but you'll notice a lot more dropped frames. So that's more or less it for the iPad 3rd generation throwback review here in 2018. At the end of the day, I would say that if you can find this tablet for under $100, especially one that comes with 32 or 64 gigs of built-in storage, I would actually go for it, because everything that you would want to do, from watching back videos, streaming, playing back a few light titles, and for web browsing, it still works really well. I would say the iPad 3rd gen is really the bottom line, however. I would not try and get an older iPad than this here in 2018, such as the iPad, maybe the second gen, for instance, which on paper also has a dual-core processor, but the screen is nowhere near as sharp. This was kind of the first Retina display on an iPad, and that it really is quite a future-proof feature as we see now. It doesn't have a fingerprint scanner, but it's not a huge deal breaker in my book, and overall things still run fairly well as far as the general navigation is concerned, and battery life is still going quite strong. So if you want a low-cost iPad and you don't want to shell out a fortune, an arm or a leg, you also want a full-size iPad and not something such as an iPad mini, which has a smaller screen, then this is actually a pretty good choice with a good build quality and still decent performance at a reduced price point. Especially compared to other $100 Android tablets on the market, I think that this is still, a decent choice if you are invested into the iOS ecosystem. Arguably, of course, the iPad 4th gen or the iPad Air, which are slightly newer and also thinner, will run on a newer version of the firmware, might be a stronger bet going forward. However, those are also more expensive. If you look on Amazon or eBay, they can actually cost 2 times the price of the iPad 3rd gen. So coming in around $200, whether double the price is still worthwhile to you if you're on a budget is the biggest question. Obviously, if you have the extra money to spare, then that still is an excellent choice. But for the lowest cost for an iPad that runs well enough, at least as a bottom line threshold here in 2018, I would say that the iPad 3rd gen is still a passable choice. So you can check out more details about this in our Throwback article, but for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. This has been the iPad 3rd generation revisited here in 2018.